So the story I am summarizing here today is forthcoming in my book project, Cremating the Body Politic, Death and Diaspora in the Hindu Caribbean, as well as an accompanying documentary film, my first, entitled Burning Identity, both of which I am completing this year. I also usually don't read papers, but I wanted to make sure and stay on time. The Caribbean was ground zero for European conjuring of the colonial modern project, westernized before there was even a West, as the late Sidney Mintz once put it. The Caribbean's precocious modernity entailed monumental global migrations and massive demographic transformations premised upon the enslavement and involuntary relocation of millions of sub-Saharan Africans, an epic paradox of immobilized mobility that impacted not only the Caribbean, but also South, Central, and North America. Emancipation was compensated for colonial elites by the advent of indentureship schemes in which thousands of South Asians, Chinese, and even more Africans were transported to plantations in the Caribbean under contracts of temporary involuntary servitude lasting 3 to 5 years. Indentured laborers often re-indentured themselves for another contract, and the majority of them chose to stay and make new homes in the West Indies instead of returning to their homelands, locking in place complex and circuitous processes of creolization and transculturation that gave shape to the region's distinctive sociocultural space. In particular, for my purposes here, hundreds of thousands of Indians from South Asia were brought to the Caribbean, especially British Guiana and Trinidad, as well as Dutch Guiana, now Suriname, with smaller numbers arriving in Jamaica and several smaller islands of the Eastern Caribbean, such as St. Lucia, Martinique, and Guadeloupe. The trip from India to the Antilles took 3 times longer than the Middle Passage. This epic instance of modern mobility was paradoxical in that they indentured themselves voluntarily in South Asia, but their decisions were typically compelled by conditions of local poverty and exploitation in India, making their decision-making highly constrained and hardly autonomous or free. Though women were demographically in the minority of indentured migrants, many of them took it as an opportunity to escape situations of domestic subjugation and violence. 239,000 Indians, South Asian Indians, Indians are all South Asian Indians in this talk, were taken to British Guiana between 1838 and 1917, with Indo-Guyanese now constituting the largest ethnic group in the Republic of Guyana. Most people don't know that. Trinidad received 144,000 indentured Indians, the majority of whom were Hindu, accompanied by a substantial minority of Muslims. Today, the Twin Island Republic of Trinidad and Tobago's 2 main ethnic groups, Afro and Indo-Trinidadians, are equivalent in demographic terms at 40% each, making for a very interesting and complex socio-political landscape. 25% of TNT's national population are Hindus. Indian indentureship in the Caribbean has been characterized by one of its most important historians as a new system of slavery, and indeed, indentured laborers were confined to plantations with no mobility or freedom. Labor exploitation was totalizing, and Indians existed under conditions of extremely circumscribed space for cultural activity and expression. There was no ownership, no recognized marriage, no education, and so forth. This was the radically new context in which a vast array of diverse traditions and identities from South Asia were fragmented, converged, and reformulated in complex novel configurations in the Caribbean. There is no evidence whatsoever for anything other than burial of the dead among Indians in colonial Trinidad. Indeed, not only did British colonial elites scorn Pyreside Hindu cremation throughout the empire, but indentured folks had neither the resources nor the space to do so, even if they had been allowed. As Indians reached the ends of their contracts, they coalesced and formed new fledgling communities around the main plantation areas of Trinidad. Indians occupied an even lower status than emancipated people of African descent, as they were the newest newcomers, competitors on the labor market, and were not Christian. Indo-Trinidadians have historically been referred to locally as East Indians, not West Indians, which in the Anglophone Caribbean is a term for people, Caribbean people. So East Indians, not West Indians, right? Ideologically reproducing their outsider status as Orientals practicing pagan Hinduism and idolatrous Islam, as seen from the dominant colonial Christian perspective. Patterns of ethno-racial spatialization and segregation from the 19th and early 20th centuries are still very much reflected in contemporary demographics. The earliest forms of Indian socioeconomic mobility transpired in the first quarter of the 20th century via newly instituted Canadian Presbyterian Church education and conversion to Presbyterianism, though less than 20% of the total local Indian population ever converted to Christianity in this way. Early Indo-centric activism for education, legal marriage recognition, cultural and religious rights, and so forth developed over the course of the first half of the 20th century, with gradually increasing numbers of Hindu and Muslim advocates joining their Presbyterian brethren. Vanguard Hindu activists also agitated for the right to cremate their dead, which finally came to pass in 1953 by the Colonial Council, a decade before independence from Britain. This effort was a trans-colonial diasporic effort on the part of pundits and activists in the Caribbean and throughout the diaspora, in addition to India itself. So trans-colonial diasporic movement, really. Legislative independence came in 1962. Then TNT became a republic in 1976 in the midst of its first major oil boom. Trinbagonian political culture has been dominated from the beginning by a racialized two-party system pitting the Black political party, which held power for the first 30 plus years of independence, versus an Indian one. A multi-ethnic, multi-party coalition emerged and captured government in the late 1980s, but soon fell apart over the race issue, as it was referred to, leading to a one-term reprise of the Black Party in the early 90s and convincing Indians that they must apparently forever fend for themselves and go it alone. In the meantime, it was the poor rural Hindu community that benefited the most socioeconomically from the oil boom of the 70s and early 80s, since they had started from the lowest structural position in society. And indeed, the 1980s saw the birth of a major Hindu revitalization movement that continues to this day, indirectly fueled by a series of hydrocarbon booms. Bollywood cinema, Indian radio stations, ethnic events, and so forth have proliferated ever since, and an index not only of Indian pride, but also opposition to Black domination of the state, political discourse, and public culture. The ripening of internal contradictions of Afro-Creole nationalism predicated upon petro-statehood, the challenge of the Black Power Revolution of 1970, and the first Islamist coup in the Americas in 1990, all contributed to the rise of what I call TNT's era of post-colonial multiculturalism in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The first Indo-Trinidadian government and prime minister came to power in the mid-90s, which further boosted the proliferation of things Indian, but especially Hinduism, which often functions, however problematically, as a cipher and an icon of diasporic Indianness more generally. Interestingly, despite legalization of Pyreside cremation in 1953, in fact, barely anyone started cremating their dead. Indeed, research as late as the 1970s attests to the continued predominance of burial and prevalent Indo-Trini view of cremation as backward, unhygienic, and so forth. Yet by the late 80s, and certainly into the 90s, the tides turned completely and Pyreside cremation became standard funerary praxis across the board for Hindus, and a series of cremation sites were constructed throughout the densest Indian areas of Trinidad. This was the state of affairs when I first started going to TNT in 1997. Thus, I took it for granted that that was the traditional state of things, and only over time came to realize what an extraordinarily recent new dispensation it was. The big question is why? This overwhelming move away from burial toward adoption of Pyreside cremation in the late 20th century, right, was understood by Hindus as a triumphant return to and revitalization of a noble ancient Indic tradition, a recuperation of the diasporic ethnic self in a sea of blackness and of Christianity. Indeed, as a reflection not only of Indo-Caribbean mobilization against the odds, but of Hindu mobility in particular, a reclamation of South Asian heritage that had been marginalized first by British colonial subjugation and subsequently by post-colonial Afro-Caribbean subjugation in turn. Note that the rise of Pyreside Hindu cremation tracks perfectly with the late 20th century rise of forthright Indian political and cultural power on the national stage, decidedly not when it was actually legalized 2 generations earlier in 1953. Reclaiming ritualization of the corpse represents not just recuperation of the body politic at a key life passage juncture, but one whose practice represents a profound cosmological gap between Hindu and Christian theology, making cremation a potent vehicle of cultural assertion and ethnic revitalization. It's the last little paragraph. Yet, ironically, Pyreside Hindu cremation in India was historically, in fact, a high caste, patriarchal, privileged practice that itself increasingly became an icon of anti-colonial opposition over the course of the late 19th and early 20th centuries by Indian nationalists in India. Indeed, the vast majority of indentured Indians brought to the Caribbean were from low caste, untouchable, and tribal groups who all traditionally practiced burial in contradistinction to their high caste superiors. Thus, the Indo-Caribbean project of revitalizing cremation is more of an invention than a revitalization per se, yet one that has transpired under the sign of diasporic heritage reclamation. This effort has not only been fueled by the cultural politics of life in the Caribbean, but also very much informed and influenced by the rise of contemporary Hindu nationalism in India, making it a layered configuration animated by multiple circuits of diasporic dynamics, last sentence. And now, in a further diasporic twist, Indo-Trinidadian Christians have more recently begun cremating their dead at Hindu cremation sites with closed instead of open caskets and biblical sermons instead of Hindu ceremonial last rites, since Pyreside cremation is now seen as the quintessentially Indian, not just Hindu way of doing things. Cultural heritage and historical memory in this instance have therefore become a diasporic hall of mirrors with no clear entrance as well as no clear exit.